Hey guys, welcome back to the shop. Today, the project at hand is to forge this large truck bearing that a friend gave me into a Bowie knife that a frontiersman would be proud to carry. First thing we need to do is take this bearing apart into usable pieces for our project. You'll notice the roller bearings, or rollers, around the outside of the bearing, and those will make some cool projects in the future, but today I'm going to use the inner ring that is the raceway that the rollers run on. And this retainer appears to just be mild steel, easily bent, and I don't think there's any good steel in that. So we'll just save the rollers and we've got our inner ring right here. You'll notice the grooves, and those could present a big problem if we just forge this as it is. It'd be very easy to accidentally fold those over in forging and create a cold shut, or basically a mechanical crack in our piece of steel, which we certainly don't want. So grinding that off clean, we can go ahead and start heating it up. Now I'm assuming this is 50-100 steel, and I have good reason to assume that, but with reclaimed steel it's always just an educated guess. But my first indication that corroborates my educated guess is that as I'm forging this steel, it definitely starts to stiffen up at an orange heat, and that is characteristic of 50-100 steel because of the 1.5% chromium content in it. You really can't forge it at a lower heat like you can with 1084 or 1095, something like that, which does not have the alloy content. So I've got this straightened out, and I need to go ahead and start forging the thickness down, mainly to even up the thickness on this piece of steel. As you'll notice, it started out with a pretty wedge or tapered shape to the cross section, one edge being thicker than the other by quite a bit. And you might think this is an advantage because we already have a bevel in the steel, when in reality it presents more of a challenge. As you can see here, every time we forge it, it turns into a banana shape. That's because one side of the steel is being forged and the other side isn't, and it necessarily spreads that out. But I was able to get that down to a more uniform thickness, although not completely the same thickness. It's close enough to work with. You go ahead and cut off the end at a bit of an angle here and start forging in the tip of the knife. The thinner side, or the thinner edge, is going to be the edge of the knife, and the thicker side is the spine. Some people are adamantly opposed to using reclaimed steel in bladesmithing, and others use reclaimed steel almost exclusively. For my part, I rarely use reclaimed steel anymore, and there's several reasons for that. One of those being, as a professional bladesmith, I want to be very conscientious about the product that I'm putting out and knowing what that is. And so buying new, unused, and known material is a high priority when it comes to that. There's a couple other reasons too, though, and one of them being that reclaimed steel often requires an additional amount of time and effort to prep the steel or work with it to get the same result that you would out of a new clean piece of steel, which you're seeing here. I will say though that I did thoroughly enjoy this forging project, and getting the bevels forged in here after the tip, and we'll see how big of a knife we can make out of this. Kind of had to go back and forth a few times to straighten it. I didn't do a counter bend on it like I could have done. I thought I would be able to get away with that a little bit more, since we do have a difference in thickness between the edge and the spine already, but I did have to kind of work it back and forth a little bit. Another reason I don't typically use reclaimed steel anymore is because, since I don't know for sure what it is, I think it's important to test the knife or the blade that you're making from that steel to ensure that it is going to perform as intended. If you're working with a piece of new steel stock, it's not necessary to test every single blade from it once you understand and know how to work with it. But in the case of reclaimed steel, it's sort of a clean slate every time, and you don't know for sure what you're working with. So that's another element to this whole thing. So we'll get a tang forged in here, and I just want to make sure that I'm not taking any more stock than I need to for the tang, but I don't want it to be too short either. That would be worse, probably. So having said that about reclaimed steel and some of the cons to it, I guess, I will say that I do think it has a place. And in my shop, that is currently an occasional cool project like this, where I take some extra time to work with a piece of steel that has a previous life as something and some piece of machinery or something. And the whole idea of taking and reforging something into a brand new tool that will live a whole nother life, there is something to that. I do appreciate that, and I totally understand people that do that on a regular basis. So certainly don't want to disparage that. I'm not one of those that is adamantly opposed to reclaimed steel. You just have to be aware that it's not the same process in a lot of ways as working with known steel. So that's just something to keep in mind. So getting this blade forged in closer, I've got the bevels mostly forged, and it's pretty close to where I want it. At least I thought it was. So I went ahead and put my maker's mark in there. And then after that I came back and looked a little bit and a little more profiling. I went ahead and did a little more work on the bevels here. Put in a little bit of a little sweep to the blade, just a slight curve. And then we'll get this straightened up here. I actually did spend a little more time on this blade than I might normally, and I really enjoyed it actually. Just forging things real clean, close to finished dimensions. It was fun. There's my little darling showing me her pterodactyl that she built. Brought it out to show me. Pretty cute. So there's our finished forged blade here. You notice some distal taper in there, and the bevel's forged in with the edge being pretty close to where I would have it if I were to rough grind it. So go ahead and clean up the profile just a little bit here, and we can go ahead and start the heat treating process. First thing being to normalize it, and then I did run a process anneal on here and a couple of grain refinement cycles. So the purpose with this project is not to replicate a specific or particular knife. Rather, I take some different design elements from various different knives, historical knives that I've seen, and try to make something that I think would fit if you were to take it back in time, and would be an appropriate piece of kit for a frontiersman, say in the 1840s, 1850s, something like that. So I did spend some time straightening this, of course, got this all straightened up, and as I began my heat treating processes, I kept having a warp that was persistent. And this isn't really surprising, because something you can run into additionally with reclaimed steel is it can have a bit of a memory. Even though it's been heated up and forged multiple times, it sometimes does not cooperate fully. So at the end of my thermocycles here, did a couple of those, and I was finally able to get that straightened out, and it didn't come back after that. So get this quenched here, and if we have a good piece of steel, it should be nice and hard. You'll notice when I was grinding it a minute ago, the real big starburst looking sparks coming off of the steel, and that's just another small indicator that we should have a good piece of high carbon steel. So it's kind of, paying attention to those little things along the way. and then of course testing the blade to make sure that it is what you think it is. So file off the layer of decarb here. It wasn't too bad at all, but get down to steel where my file would not cut. So real good indication right there. Got a good hard blade, and we can go ahead and temper it and impart or regain some toughness to the blade here before we move on. So now that it's fully heat treated, we can grind the blade. And normally I would have rough ground it. I actually forgot to, but if I'd been thinking about it, I might have just left it on purpose, because I ended up forging this one real close, leaving some additional material to remove and get everything completely flat and straight. But one thing you can do if you've got any minor, straightness issues on your blade is leave a little bit of extra material to where you can grind that in. And although it wasn't intentional in this case, that's kind of what I ended up doing. But definitely had an appropriate cross section on the blade just from forging to go into heat treating with, so it worked out great. Go ahead and grind in the shoulders for the guard on the ricasso here, and I'm using a carbide insert file guide on an aluminum oxide belt, and the aluminum oxide belts are not nearly as hard as like the ceramic belts, and while they do work, they wear out a lot faster. But in this case, it's just barely scuffing that carbide insert, so you're able to use it in that manner and put those shoulders in. Now on to hand sanding, and I'll go up to 220 grit and stop there. Go ahead and grind a bevel, primary bevel on the blade here, put an edge on it and strop it up real nice on the buffing wheel. Quick and easy way to do that. And it is hair popping sharp. And we're going to go ahead and test this blade, especially since we're using reclaimed steel. We don't know for sure what this steel is. I have a pretty good idea, but I want to make sure that it's going to perform as intended, as it needs to. So chopped through the 2x4 twice, had a little trouble hanging on to the blade there, but got through it, and it is still shaving sharp. So pretty happy with that. I actually went ahead and chopped through it a third time, and it still shaved. So I'm happy with that. I do think this is 52-100, and at the very least, it's performing very well. So we have a good blade. Finished hand sanding that, went up to 600 grit on this one, and we can go ahead and move on to building a guard. So using some brass stock here, establish a bit of a center line here on this piece, and mark where we need to start cutting in the slot for the tang. Of course, this starts with drilling out a series of holes smaller than the finished tang size, and we'll use some power tools to the extent that we can and remove some of the material, most of the material, but there is still a lot of hand filing when it comes to fitting a guard like this. So get it close and use a couple of different files. This is a small chainsaw file. And once we're close enough, we can begin putting some pressure on it and getting a nice tight fit right up to the shoulders on the ricasso. Little bit by little bit, and we're finally there. Got a nice fit up. And now I can go ahead and mark off where I want to shape the guard based on where the ricasso sits. That way you're not trying to put a slot in there, a tang slot in there that fits a outside dimension. It's easier to do it this way. I'll use the work rest on my flat platen to keep everything square, and then I can go ahead and round off those corners and put a radius on the edge of the guard. That brass heats up fast, so keeping it cool as you're working with it is important just to be able to hold on to it. So now that we have the guard mostly finished, I'm going to start on a spacer. And working with another chunk of brass here, we'll go ahead and mark off where we need to put a slot for the tang to fit through. And using the same method of drilling and Dremel and filing, we've got that fit up as well. Now we need to grind the profile or the shape of this spacer, a nice oval shape to grip, and it's looking pretty good here. But we're not going to leave it plain. That would be a little too plain, so I'm going to use my calipers to scratch a line around the circumference of this spacer and give me a reference point to grind in a nice little ferrule or groove here. Just really, it's going to make this look a lot nicer. Being really careful starting out, make sure that I'm following that line, and then as it starts to be established, I can go ahead and grind that groove in a little more aggressively. And then finally, sand everything and get it up to a particular finish before we move on to the next stage. I'm using a block of desert ironwood for the handle, and I need to mark in where the tang needs to fit. And then I stopped and I went ahead and buffed out the spacer. I'm not sure why I did that at this point. I just wanted to see what it would look like, I guess. I was initially thinking I might do a hand rubbed finish on the brass, but it just looks so much better buffed out and shiny, polished. So there you go. We're going to go ahead and drill out this handle block, and again, using some drill bits and doing a series of holes, we can get it started. And I am going to go ahead and use the burn-in method to complete the tang fit up here. The way I do this is to burn in the tang, and then I'll use a scraping tool. It looks a little bit like a hook with an edge on it to carve out or scrape out the last little bit here. I don't want a whole bunch of charred material inside there. That's not the strongest material. So we can use both methods to end up with an appropriate result here. So after some careful sanding on a flat surface plate, we've got the block of wood matched up to the spacer, nice and clean, and we can go ahead and mark around that spacer where the handle wood needs to meet. And I'm doing sort of a heirloom, or as some call it, a museum. I'm not sure why they call that museum fit, heirloom fit. That's the terms used for this this method here. So instead of matching the wood directly up to the edge of that spacer, we're going to put a bit of a radius or even chamfer, and that wood's going to sit out from the spacer a little bit. This is historically correct. You'll see Bowie knives with this type of handle and this type of fit up. Maybe that's why it's called an heirloom fit. But it does a couple of things. It does ease in the fit up process, but it also allows for expansion or contraction of the wood without leaving a glaring and obnoxious edge or catch where two surfaces are no longer matching. So I've got that handle wood shaped up to the shape that I want here, and again, that's a pretty fairly ubiquitous handle shape you'll see in historical Bowie knives. I want to put a brass butt cap on this knife here, on this handle. This is also something that you'll see on historic Bowie knives, various designs of a butt cap, and it's not integral to the tang. It's simply attached to the end of the handle. And you could do where you run the tang all the way through and thread it on and so forth, and the butt cap is part of that process. That's not what we're doing here. We're going to pin the tang on this handle so it'll be plenty strong. So I use the burn-in method again and then sanded off the charred material so we don't have weakened material, but we do have a nice fit up. It's just like when you hot shoe a horse. You get it close and then burn in that shoe for a perfect fit. When that's epoxied on there, we can go ahead and drill out a couple of 3/32 holes for some pins that will really just lock this butt plate onto the handle. These are nickel silver pins, which actually isn't silver at all. It's an alloy of copper and nickel, but they make for a nice contrast. We'll go ahead and pin those down. Getting real close here, we'll go ahead and drill out for a pin to make a very secure setup on this handle. It's epoxied in there. I didn't show that, but it's epoxied in there, and we're going to go ahead and add an additional high level of mechanical security to this. I actually pilot drilled this with a couple different sizes, and the final size is 3/16, and that's the size of our brass pin that is also epoxied in there. And then finally we can go ahead and pin those over and make a nice crowned pin there.
Alright guys, don't go anywhere. I'm going to show you some pictures of the knife in just a second, but I will say this is probably the coolest knife handle that I've put on a blade before, and that just, you know, speaking to the way it all fits together in the whole package, I'm pretty happy with the way it turned out. What do you think? Is this something a frontiersman would have been proud to carry? Let me know in the comments below. And if you've enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and that notifications bell. All of that helps support the channel and helps me bring you more content like this. As always, thanks for watching, and we will see you on the next video.